Welcome to the Deep End at Wesleyan. This is a new podcast series exploring the ways that faculty, teachers, scholars at North Carolina Wesleyan University bring their research and scholarly work into the classroom to enrich and enliven our students' education. My name is Joe Lane, and I am honored to be the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at North Carolina Wesleyan. In the 3 years that I have led the academic program here, I have been so encouraged to see our faculty actively engaged in leading work in their fields, and I'm excited to bring their stories to our listeners. If you're an alum, trustee, or friend of Wesleyan, you should be very proud to see the work our faculty are doing. If you're a student or a prospective student, I hope you will hear something that catches your ear and your interest. Perhaps you can find a professor whose class you would like to take or whose research team you would like to join. If you're a faculty member at Wesleyan, I hope you'll be impressed with the work of your colleagues and will consider coming on a future episode to tell us about what you're up to. Today, in our second episode, we're talking to Dr. Doreen Thierauf, Associate Professor of English. Dr. Thierauf, as we will discuss, was recently honored with tenure and promotion to the rank of Associate Professor. She comes from a fascinating background that brought her to the United States for graduate study at the University of North Carolina and eventually here. Dr. Thierauf, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the broad outlines of your work and how you got into studying what you study.
Yeah, sure. So starting at age 12, I wanted to become an astrophysicist. And that obviously didn't happen. So in the way this worked, I always wanted to be an academic ever since I learned that you could get a PhD in something. I wanted one. But I was very, very interested in science and technology, especially I was a space nerd as a teenager. And then we had this program in Germany where I'm from that you could take some classes just over the summer before you actually started college. And I visited a physics class, and I realized very quickly that I was not quick enough. I'm probably smart enough, but not quick enough. And so I went upstairs to where the linguists and the literature people were, and I felt that's where I belonged. And so Germans started learning English when I was in middle school, Germans started learning English at age 10 or 11, so like 5th grade. Today we start earlier, but that was sort of the norm back in the day. And so I remember I sat in 10th grade English class, and we read excerpts of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and that hooked me. And I read it in the original English. We had like a little bookstore in my hometown. This was before the internet. So I went to this bookstore, and there was an entire wall of just English books. It was very intimidating because I didn't quite know the language yet to be sort of fluent reader. But I dug through all of Jane Austen's work. It works in 10th grade or 11th grade, somewhere around then. And then I needed more. I needed more of my historical romance. And then I went to the Bronte sisters. And after that, I was pretty hooked. And then after doing this little, we call it Schnupperstudium, where you kind of just smell what academic studies smell like, I decided to become a literary scholar. So, and there was a wonderful professor at my university, my alma mater, University of Rostock, was a freshly tenured professor in her early 30s. It was like, I want to be her.
And now you are.
And now I am. It's very strange, very strange. Yeah.
When you first came from the University of Rostock as an exchange student, did it click immediately that you wanted to study and teach in the United States?
I was told, so I had a wonderful year. I got a Fulbright grant to do non-degree seeking graduate studies for a year, which now I realize what just an amazing privilege that was, because I got a tuition waiver from the University of Georgia, and I got a Fulbright grant that took care of everything else in terms of money. So I just got this amazing packet, and I was told. I took some classes with people who are now my colleagues and who I've organized panels with and who I see at conferences all the time. I was told by them that I was the real deal, and so I kind of chose to believe them. And they gave me, I received wonderful mentoring during that year, and they gave me some hints and tips for the academic, sort of for the doctoral application. And we made top 10 lists. Here's where you should apply. And it ended up working, which I'm still astonished about.
And did you always know this path would lead you into teaching? And what about teaching in particular at North Carolina Wesleyan did you find attractive?
Yeah, I went to grad school, I think, because, sometimes I think back at this, and I think I went to grad school for the knowledge. I wanted to be a reader. I wanted to be a writer. And the way academia in America works, when you're a graduate student, you also teach. And I felt when I started grad studies that teaching was a necessary evil. And I wasn't very good at it. I remember the first time I taught, I actually had a panic attack in class. And my students were so sweet. They actually counted me through it, and they did a popcorn reading of the syllabus until I had caught myself. And I realized that I had to give more attention to it, and perhaps more attention than other people deem necessary, because I'm a very sort of embodied teacher. Like, I need to kind of feel the room. I need to very much project, like I need to project the hour. I need to know exactly what's happening when and how everybody's going to react. So I started perhaps over-preparing for my classes, and that ended up serving me very well, because within 2 or 3 years at UNC, where I taught, I earned all the teaching awards that they had. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of spoiled me and also kind of rewired my expectation of what I would do as a scholar. And so I was very glad when I saw the job ad, which was in 2018, it was posted in 17, I believe, that this would fit. I wanted to be a teacher. I knew I was good at it, and I wanted a challenge. And also, there were hardly any jobs in my field. So this idea of being a full-time researcher was already elusive in graduate school. It was something that very few people are able to do these days. And so I thought teaching at Wesleyan would be the best track for me. And one of my mentors at UNC also told me that the students at UNC don't really need me, but the students at Wesleyan might need me. And I love that. Like, that was flattering. But they needed someone of my training.
That's an amazing story. I can hardly imagine, having sat in on your classes and the self-assured way in which you conduct a class, to think that you had a panic attack on your first day.
This was my moment of birth or rebirth or something. It was still one of the worst days of my life. I cried in the parking lot. It was bad. And then needed to go back in. Like, you always go back in.
Yeah. A good piece of lesson to give to our students. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the field in which you work. Yeah. What separates Victorian literature from other English literature as a category? There's got to be more to this than just who happened to be Queen of England for that 64 years. What would you say are the key markers of the field?
So I think it came out of just basic historical periodization. So the field emergence comes literally out of the years that Victoria was on the throne, from 1837 to 1901. We also have something, in a relatively recent formation in the field, that's called the long 19th century, which starts with about the French Revolution, the kicking in of the Industrial Revolution, all the way up to World War I. So we go from sort of pre-industrial agrarian society to sort of the war machine, right? So in terms of I'm interested in this modernization literature. I'm interested in the Victorian period because, as all Victorians will tell you, we are still Victorian. We're still in this sort of project of modernity. And I'm very interested to trace how our ways we think about the family, about the work, about technology, about gender norms, about nature, about the universe, about religion, how all these things emerged at that time.
So it's a field that in some ways might be characterized as Marxist. I want to put real scare quotes around that terminology because it has some heavy implications in American context, which we don't mean here, but in the sense that the transformation of the economic system in which people lived transformed other parts of their lives, and this is literature that's working that out?
Not necessarily. I don't think that the field centers economic forms of production. Okay. And it's also actually quite a traditional field, so even the political timbre tends to not be Marxist. It is more about the project of scientific and academic formation and institutionalization, which is not only Marxist, although Althusser would say, you have the kind of main structure of and then the superstructure of culture. But that's not what makes the field the field. The field is interested in the transition from pre-modernity to modernity, and the sort of the doyens of sort of the old canon tend to be sort of male essayists thinking through religion, the individual, empire, right? All of these concerns. And then ever since the 70s, with sort of kind of like actually sort of Marxist and feminist scholars and even later eco scholars coming into the field, kind of widening the scope of these concerns. But I think and it's a fascinating question because Victorians don't ask themselves these questions. I think at the heart is coming from an agrarian society and ending up with the city. How did we get there?
Okay. And who are the authors that you most want to share from that period and why? What would you say makes these texts that can seem old, I think, to our students? Yeah. We all have to overcome that bias, immediate and relevant.
So it's like the worst question to ask a literary scholar is like, who's your favorite author? Because
I said authors. I didn't want to be narrow.
Yeah. You didn't ask me this, right? But I get this question a lot from my students or from other people. Like, who do you like? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I read so many. I think there are very important authors that I think we will keep teaching, like reading and teaching. But the canon is actually right now in a big shift where I am not teaching how I was taught. So if you would take my Victorian survey, which I teach next semester, it will look very different from how I was taught when I started my major in 2003. So it used to be that there was a huge focus on poetry. You might have heard of the big five poets, so Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, and so on, Coleridge, Byron. Those voices tend to be less prioritized these days. We are also going into... So we're moving into a broader, so long 19th century focus. So back in the day, for a 19th century scholar, you would have to read the Romantic poets. That is maybe in grad school, that is still required, but in undergrad you don't. And you would also have to get some of the big urban novels under your belt, so like Dickens's Hard Times, or Great Expectations, or Bleak House. Bleak House is very famous. Or what many people think is the best novel ever written, which is George Eliot's Middlemarch. I was taught these texts in undergrad, and I have shifted away from those. They can be unwieldy, they're very long. Teaching habits have changed. I cannot ask students to read a 400, 500-page novel in 2 weeks. It's not happening. So I teach usually one fat novel in my general education survey, which is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which is a long novel, and we spent 3 weeks on it. And it's a very, very good novel because it posits the self-possessed individual who kind of shares her secrets with the audience, and that tends to catch students' attention, and it teaches very, very well. So this is like my one fat book that I teach. And most of the time I teach shorter works. I teach travel journals. I teach some novels from the 20th century, for instance, that reflect back on the 19th century. So, for instance, there's a wonderful book called White Sargasso by Jean Rhys that is a rewrite of Jane Eyre. So I like to teach those back to back so that students kind of get, like, they become very familiar with Jane's voice in Jane Eyre, and then Jean Rhys defamiliarizes Jane for us again. It teaches really spectacularly well. But I also focus on poetry that I myself would not have been taught, for instance, of Black authors or authors that hadn't even written poetry when I was an undergrad, so like very new texts that then reflect back on the themes.
Great. So let's get into some of the concepts that define your work. And you often explore in your academic writing themes of desire, of rape, abortion. Yeah, these are pretty heavy topics. I can imagine many of our students and maybe some of our colleagues would be like, oh, no, let's not discuss that, right?
For sure.
Even bringing them up puts people in uncomfortable places. Why do you think they're so important, and how do you unpack them without scaring students off from the discussion?
It's an art, right? I always say to my students that I like to look into the abyss of how humans behave to each other. And then I invite them to look with me, but only as far as they want to go. And so I have an undergrad in English and German from a German university. And then I did my master's in Germany, and it was a double master's in history and English. And my focus for the history part was actually on sort of what I would now call like atrocity studies. It was like focused on war and genocide. So we talked about Darfur. There was literally a genocide class. It was just, we talked, and my big project was on rape in Darfur as a weapon of war. But we would talk about the Holocaust, and I was very interested in American slavery. And then, a decade later, my dissertation posits that a lot of the storytelling we see in the 19th century about, for instance, violence about pregnancy actually come out of the slave narrative, have to do with atrocities of, in this case, Caribbean slavery, so British Caribbean slavery. And it's not pleasant.
No.
It's also, to me, the most important thing in the world that I want to talk about. And the way I teach it, and it's very, like, also when I read these texts, I always think about right away, like, how do I want to teach this? How can I teach this? And there's some stuff I wouldn't, like, impose upon my students. There's just some stuff that's really, really bleak. And other texts that are pretty horrific, I have taught as kind of a genre. So, for instance, if you know Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is a very, very just heavy, my students would call it heavy, book talking about a mother murdering her daughter to prevent her from being enslaved herself. I taught that as a horror class, like or as a horror text, like in the context of a horror class, because I think that then lends us sort of the ability to look into the abyss together. But right now, also for my Victorian class, for instance, I teach a slave narrative, the history of Mary Prince, and it has several scenes of hinted sexual violation on there. There's a moment where she has to bathe her enslaver in a bathtub. And so I go very slowly. I tend to give some content advisory where I say, this is what we're going to do now. And if you're at any point uncomfortable, you may step out. And then we're doing what's called close reading. So it's a close engagement with the text. I would usually project a passage on the screen. And then I just ask my students, I would invite them to tell me what they see. And oftentimes the text reveals more about itself than the author intended, or even the audience at the time intended. And so we will sometimes spend 15, 20 minutes familiarizing ourselves with that text, and then kind of go from what we see on the screen or what we see at the top of the class to what the associations we have with it in our own daily life. And you try to navigate this in a way that everybody feels safe. And so and this has happened in the past where a student noped out and said, like, why are you doing this? I'm offended. I cannot deal with this. And then you stop and you do something else. Like, it needs to be accessible for everybody. And if someone feels unsafe in there, then I will, like, this is one of the principles of teaching, I think, and teaching ethically is to, bring something else to the table so we can focus on something that brings us together.
That's interesting. I had not really thought about it until you were saying it, but obviously some of the roots of what we now consider to be horror are in Victorian literature, and the first of the classic kind of monster dramas, if you will. So it's interesting that you raise horror because I think it's a genre that in broad terms our students feel like they like this and they know this. And horror has these roots in the Victorian period, but there are ways in which the horror that they now watch, M. Night Shyamalan's movies, is very different than the type of monster that we find in a Dracula or Frankenstein, and what that says. Do you have any ideas about kind of what they've taken from Victorian horror and what they don't recognize about it?
Oh, for sure. So there's something called like horror studies or Gothic studies, and which is a subfield of my field, right? So a lot of my colleagues work full time on horror. I've done Gothic stuff. The slave narrative the slave narratives I look at are all sort of rendered as melodramatic horror, so the melodramatic Gothic. So the words I use, the ways the atmosphere, the scene is set is often very Gothic. And so horror studies, the first sort of axiom of horror studies is that it's a counter movement to rationalism, right? Sort of to the sort of emerging positivism, to the field formations of sociology, of the standardizations of capitalism, of industrialization, because the universities and the sort of growing knowledge base that sort of early industrialized England had amassed kind of demystified or disenchanted the world. The enchantment lives on in the Gothic, right? So you have specters, you have ghosts, you have things that, we thought were dead, in the past, the aristocracy or Catholicism for the British or whatever, and they keep coming back, and you have these specters that haunt you, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I actually teach a class called Victorian Monsters, where we we also read novels that claim to be realistic, but then have sort of a little Gothic bent. So, for instance, I would teach Wuthering Heights. I do teach Dracula. I taught Frankenstein earlier this year in that course. And Frankenstein's not a Victorian novel; it's a romantic novel. But all of these novels try to think through like rapid societal change. What happens when society changes? What is left behind? What are the ghosts that keep haunting us, right? So, in our students, I think they love this course. I always get a lot of students who are very, like my students always tell me they're excited to be in the room with me. When I taught horror a couple years ago, I didn't get the sense that they were that excited, but that was also during the pandemic, so they might have been done with being scared because it's also a lot of hard work. But for my Victorian horror course, I think, and I have this final assignment, I call it the monster show, where they have to come up with a monster themselves, like what they find scary. And so you often see, it's fascinating what haunts them, right, about the text we read. So, for instance, one person made and I allow them the greatest sort of freedom in how they want to create that assignment. So some students prefer to write a formal research paper. Other people will paint something or make a poetry collection. And one student did a sculpture, and she made a sculpture of we read Tessa of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, which is a story with sexual violence in it. Mm-hmm. And she made a figurine of the character that is violated, but as a kind of Medusa, so a vengeful character. So she made this beautiful sculpture out of clay with sort of Tess, with sort of like big hair and like a frown, like an angry sneer. And she was gonna overcome her trauma and then seek revenge. Right, so it's fascinating what students see in these courses, what they take with them.
That's great. I always want us to spend kind of the last third of each of these podcasts by circling back to the classroom. And in your case, you've brought a lot of your research activity to the classroom. Tell us a little bit about how you view pedagogical research and why pedagogy is an essential part of your research.
Yeah, I've made the case, and I try to make waves. I don't know how big those waves are, but I've tried to make the case that my field, Victorian Studies, has to prioritize pedagogy. I am part of, we call ourselves the pedagogy writing team. We're 6 scholars, all about the same age, at similar institutions across the United States. And if I have to, may I spell them all out and give them a shout out?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so it's Kim Cox at Chadron State College in Nebraska. It's Rhea Das at Prairie View A&M in Texas. It's Shannon Drucker at Siena College. It's Ashley Nadeau at Utah Valley University. Kate Nesbitt at Central College in Iowa, and me. And we found ourselves through sort of overlapping coteries and sort of people with connections. I've gone to my field conference since 2012 almost annually, so over time you kind of amass your cohort. And so we all came together during the pandemic, or during the sort of tail end of the pandemic, thinking through, as we're thinking through, what do we want for the field in the future? Because for a lot of us, the pandemic was sort of a hinge point, a time when we were thinking a lot, why are we scholars? Does this matter? Who is this for? And we felt that we spent most of the time thinking about teaching students who were, at that time, very, very unhappy, very damaged by the pandemic. A lot of us in literary studies stopped assigning long-form essays because students could not handle the workload. And so we wrote a piece a couple of years ago called Prioritizing Pedagogy in Victorian Studies, and we got it published in one of the sort of premier journals to make the case that our field conferences should focus more strongly on pedagogy and should recognize pedagogy as a research endeavor. Because teaching well, and especially in a field that has lost a lot of its sort of cachet, cultural cachet, social cachet that it used to have, even during my undergrad time, is hard. We need to make the case more strongly why we should get funding, why we should have the jobs we have, why our students should take our classes, why my students should dig through Wuthering Heights, over the course of 2 weeks. And so that is work and that is research. And so we've gotten pretty good feedback on this. And I should also mention that my field is changing. We have fewer jobs. A lot of the a lot of graduate students today who are trained to be R1 scholars will not get that R1 job or any job. Most people in my field will end up generalists. So I teach everything from 1800 to now, right? I teach British, Anglophone literature. I do also lots of American. Right now I'm teaching a course with only American text in it. So you need to be flexible and not stop growing, right? So it's very rare for people with PhDs to teach only Victorian texts. That just almost doesn't happen anymore, right? So I feel my field, if it wants to survive, because there's also there's a generational shift going on, we have fewer assistant professors. If that conference wants to survive, if my field wants to survive, we need to expand our notion of what counts as scholarship, what counts as serious endeavors, what is worthy of earning tenure, right? And I'm very grateful that my institution acknowledges my work as tenure worthy.
Right. Is there, that's obviously a lot of extrinsic reasons why pedagogical research is important. What about intrinsically, does the subject matter, space, and form of Victorian literature particularly lend itself to cultivating pedagogical research? Are these texts that are good when properly leveraged for teaching?
Oh, for sure. And education, the way we do it now, comes out of the Victorian period. We're all still Victorians.
Right.
So earliest pedagogical research comes from that time. The essay is a Victorian invention. So if you are a teacher anywhere and you're assigning a 5-paragraph essay, that has its roots. It has roots like also during the Enlightenment, but the Victorians, arguably, you can argue with me about this, but I will win. The Victorians brought the genre to its full fruition. The essay tends to be an exploration of a personal standpoint using evidence, and it's a researched argument, basically. And this is what the way we communicate knowledge today in academia, right, comes out of that. And so I think the texts themselves from the Victorian period, because when I ask students, like, what are the books from the 19th century you know, they will say stuff like Frankenstein, they will say stuff like Dracula, they will say things like, I don't know, Wuthering Heights is also one of those, or like Dickens's Hard Times is often taught. I think our culture still assigns incredible or immense value to these as something that you should have read to be able to navigate like the present, because these texts had a significant impact on how we think about society, how we think about the individual, right? A lot of the Victorian novels invents the individual. There would be no American individualism without, all these writers. Like, this is sort of the big thesis of novel studies, is that the novel invents the 19th century individual and we have inherited it.
That's great. And so it really raises a fascinating question about one of the essays that you and your Victorian colleagues have written about the act of teaching in an age of AI. I mean, if the essay is an embodied and reasoned argument with both the reason and the narrator being prime characters that have to exist for the essay to be real, can an algorithm really kill the essay? And as practitioners of pedagogy, how do we preserve what's best about the essay assignment in a world that's greatly changed? And
this is the big question, right? So the piece that my colleagues and I have drafted, we are advocating for non-essay, like the second third of, or the final third of this essay is about sort of alternative assignment designs. But I insist in this essay also, or we insist in this essay, that the essay can survive, but it needs to kind of take a different shape. My argument would be that it should be more Victorian. So more like make the I more present, draw from experience, and then bring in researched outside information to kind of bolster the voice of the individual, right? And I will always tell my students that I want them to write with verve. I want voice. I want their experience. And this is something that AI, for right now at least, can't do well. So I have been shifting, because I'm also a writing instructor here. I teach part of the first year writing curriculum, and I assign an academic essay still. And it's harder, and I've changed my rubrics around a bit so that I hear the voice of the students more. I don't actually, and I've never graded sort of for grammatical correctness or for sort of quote unquote standard English adherence, and I'm even less interested in that now. I want there to be errors in there because then I know that you've written it. So I don't want a polished piece, like the editor can polish it for you, or we can run it through an AI algorithm and then it'll be polished. But I kind of want to see how you think, how you learn to think through writing. And we might be in a cultural moment again of transition, just like the pandemic was, and we just keep having them more closely together, where we are turning into a society that doesn't think through writing, that might think through video or through podcasts, through talking. We don't know. I am kind of at home in the thinking through writing space, and that's why I'm a writing teacher, right? But it might be that in 10 years, we have different assignments, and everything is just a podcast assignment. And that might be fine. I think there's something about the essay that allows for a depth and nuance that we don't often get in, like, for instance, like spoken conversation. Because I don't get to go back right now and like edit my last word for a final word, right? But I think at this point, I'm definitely teaching around AI. I'm not interested in teaching with AI as much because, first of all, it's fleeting. I can't promise my students I will prepare them for a job that might actually be rationalized out of existence through AI. So I try to encourage them to hone their thinking and writing skills with writing for as long as I can.
And so, with that said, what skills and insights and experiences do you want to bring from your research into your classes? How do you want to get your undergraduates to ultimately be able to engage in making their argument theirs?
Oh, that's a good question. Very complex. If I can use an example, so I'm editor of NCW's online undergraduate research journal, Omnium, which is Latin for everything.
Everything.
And I teach with Omnium in all of my writing classes. So I don't use my own research, right? I use my students' research to teach my students research.
Right.
And it's often we start those essays with a starting question, a starting position. There's a wonderful essay in Omnium from a couple of years ago about how, for instance, one student thinks through how she can project into the future now that a parent has died. She starts in her introduction with just telling a story, sort of a personal narrative about how she encountered the death of a parent, and then researches, like relates to psychological research on children losing their parents, how they can project a future. And so she measures what she's experiencing against what the scholars are saying. It's this beautiful woven back and forth of that student. And this student actually wasn't my student. It was in a different class. We just published it in Omnium that year because she ran for it. So I don't know her personally. It's a beautiful essay, very well crafted. And so I use that student asserting herself, there's also a burden there, right? There's hurt, there's so much grief. And then trying to write herself through that grief by, finding knowledge that other people have given her, and then tying that all together into an argument about how to survive. I think that's really lovely. Does this answer your question?
Yes,
the way
no.
I bring research and one's own positionality together.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I sometimes think that when I went to college, I was good at it, and it led me to graduate school and certain success. But in some ways, I went through university at a nadir for the essay. We weren't supposed to say I. It wasn't supposed to be our argument. It was supposed to be empirically exactly so. And even though we all have a partial perspective, we never let that into the way we wrote.
That's right.
Whereas a Victorian, essay might be a loose appellation here, but something like Tintern Abbey is very personal.
Yes, and it's almost sort of an autoethnographic exploration of yourself, right?
Right.
And I have to say, I didn't always teach like this. I taught at UNC. I taught honors pre-med writing, so first year writing course for students who wanted to become medical doctors. And so there was no I. It was all passive voice and be rational and objective and only use stats and data. And I feel with the advent of AI, I don't have to teach like that anymore. Like, the AI will write for you like that. You'll figure that out. And I'm mostly worried for students who wish to go to graduate school and they need a writing sample. And that writing sample is going to read as manufactured by AI and they're not going to get in. Right? So we do need to still teach the craft. And the craft will shift. And I this is my personal prediction, I don't know if that's true, but the craft will shift towards writing with more voice because AI right now doesn't have a voice. It doesn't, like I can smell AI writing from 30 feet. I can look at the first two sentences. Yeah, this is not written by a student. It is so distinctive.
So your advice for an undergraduate student who thinks they might want to go into a deeper graduate study really would center on finding a distinctive voice and mission?
That's what I would say. Yeah. I mean, that's my advice for right now. If I were on a selection committee for a grad program and I see an essay that sounds like it's ChatGPT, like we would not, or I would not want that student to work with me, right? So I don't know. It's hard. We're in flux. It might also be that the AI model, the way sort of technology companies are setting it up, because right now it's free. It might not stay free. And it might be accessible only for wealthy people, and you might have to signal your wealth by using AI written essays. I don't know this, but I don't think we haven't even begun to understand what's happening to writing. And so we need to kind of stay on our toes there.
Oh, what a wonderful way of, I mean, it's bleak in some ways, or at least could have a dark side, but a way to close the circle, to the Victorian period, which after all was, you know better than I, but probably distinguished in some ways by nothing so much as the general availability of books, that you no longer had to be rich to have access to a library, and I'm assuming your work would be aimed at preserving that part of the Victorian period, that the access to the learning and the...
For sure. But it's also about, the Victorian period was marked by accelerating change. And we are still in it. Like, it's faster for us, I think, than for people in the 19th century. Some people in the 19th century saw as much change as we did, and some people, could live a life that was relatively stable and nothing changed. But for if you were sort of in a rural community that maintained its stability. But a lot of people felt extremely, unmoored. And I think you see this with a lot of writing teachers right now. I'm part of many sort of occasional sort of groups on social media where writing teachers come together to commiserate or to give each other tips. And lots of people are worried about where this is headed. And that they're like, if we don't teach, the 5-paragraph essay in 7th grade and it's all AI work, what are the students, in 5-6 years going to be in our classroom like? Right? Will they know how to write a sentence? Or will it all be oral? Or will it all be bullet points? Like, how does thinking happen, right? So, and I am trained in a very specific tradition, and I might have to retrain again, right? And that's after the pandemic, and everybody's tired. That's a big challenge. But there's just forward.
There's just forward. What a great way to end a conversation. Dr. Thierauf, thank you so much. This has been a great deal of fun, and we appreciate your sharing your thoughts on this with us, and hope that we can circle back in a couple of years to see what else we've learned in this period of accelerating change that we might be able to carry forward into the life beyond.
I love that. Thank you, Dr. Lee.